Hi, I'm Mick Davie, your iFit guide, and today we're going to travel back in time here in Turkey to one of the most infamous battles of World War I. We're about to board a ferry headed to the battlefields of Gallipoli, and together we'll retrace the steps that saw Ottoman forces repel an Allied attack led by Britain and France. Thousands of visitors travel to Gallipoli each year, and today I want you to join me as we experience what happened there, pay our respects, and learn about the incredible acts of heroism and sacrifice that took place across the water at Gallipoli. So feel free to get warmed up on your machine and let's get started. This was a battle of incredible significance. 9 months of fighting left 500,000 dead and wounded on both sides. Veterans of the campaign would later say, there were no winners at Gallipoli, only survivors. But the consequences of this battle were felt around the world. From the Turkish perspective, its victory at Gallipoli was a defining moment in its history, a last stand in the heroic defense of the Ottoman Empire, and it ushered in a new hero, Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, who would go on to establish a majority Muslim but secular nation-state. On the Allied side, England's dominance on the world stage would never be the same after Gallipoli. Australia had its national baptism by fire and emerged from Britain's shadow, and Gallipoli gave both Australians and New Zealanders their country's sense of nationhood. So I grew up in Australia and we learned about the Gallipoli campaign from a very young age. And every year, thousands of Australians make a kind of pilgrimage to Gallipoli to understand what happened here, to learn how this place shaped our nation, and to pay their respects to the thousands who gave their lives. And for us, this is sacred ground. When I was a teenager growing up in Australia, I was part of my school's Army Cadet Corps, and every year on April 25th, we'd march with our town's war veterans to commemorate Anzac Day, which was originally designed to honour those who had served and died here in the Gallipoli campaign. And it was such a solemn occasion, and I felt really proud to be part of that silent parade. Now, after 8 months of a bloody stalemate on the beaches of Gallipoli, the Australian soldiers suffered 28,000 casualties and left behind more than 8,700 dead when they withdrew from the peninsula. An Australian journalist at the time named Bill Sellers wrote that Australia was born as a nation on April 25th, 1915, because of the enormous blood sacrifice that it made fighting in that great war. Up ahead here, there's an absolutely extraordinary sculpture that I'll tell you about when we get a little bit closer. So that notion of nationhood is really beautifully represented in this sculpture, which is topped by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the founder and the first president of modern Turkey. And spiraling down the rest of the sculpture are other symbolic figures of the war. Turkish soldiers intertwined with Australian soldiers, a British soldier, an Indian soldier wearing a turban, a New Zealand soldier, and perhaps most moving at the bottom is a weeping Turkish mother. Gallipoli was a truly global battle, and in this sculpture you can see the primary forces that fought here. But prior to Gallipoli, the Australian and New Zealand armies had never been truly tested before. In fact, the Commonwealth of Australia had just come into being in 1901, 14 years before the Battle of Gallipoli. Now, there's a quote that I love from Sergeant Charles Lasseron from the 13th Battalion of the Australian Imperial Forces as he describes Australians coming together to fight here. And he said, "I suppose that nothing short of such a great international crisis could have brought together and made bedfellows of such a queer mixture of human beings, out of workers, deadbeats, sailors, an odd man or two in uniform, farmers, a stiff collar here, a ragged coat, and an unwashed face there. Out of such a weird gathering, it seemed impossible that an army could ever be formed." And so indeed it was. Up here ahead, there's another really remarkable piece of war art that I'd like to show you before we get to the actual battlefields. This is a representation, this sculpture here, of the two sides. The Turks dug into their trenches over here. The Allies, represented by the Anzacs, the Australians and the New Zealanders, over here. And you might think, how could this possibly be to scale? But in fact, for much of the battle at Gallipoli, this is exactly the proximity in which the two sides fought. Often the Australians, the New Zealanders, were separated in their trenches from their enemies, the Turks, by only a matter of yards. They were close enough to engage in hand-to-hand combat. They were close enough to lob grenades and bombs into each other's trenches. The fighting was incredibly intimate and incredibly bloody. Let's keep going up this way. We're headed for Anzac Cove. So this is our ferry. You're going to feel your machine kick up a little bit here as we take these stairs. Let's head up one more flight of stairs. The view's pretty spectacular from up here. So the ferry is about to depart, and to understand why we're here and why this area is so strategic, we need to get a sense of the Dardanelles Strait. This narrow sea passage that connects the Aegean Sea to the Sea of Marmara also separates the continent of Europe from the continent of Asia and has for centuries been a site of conflict. But of course, this idea came from somebody, and whose idea was it? None other than the famed military strategist Winston Churchill. In 1914, Churchill, a young man, was a rising star of British politics, and he believed he had a solution for the impasse on the Western Front, and he championed a proposal to strike more than 1,000 miles to the east, right here in Gallipoli. So this is Anzac Cove, and in the wake of the failed naval attack, the Allies started to prepare for a large-scale invasion of this, the Gallipoli Peninsula. Troops from Australia, New Zealand, and the French colonies joined forces with British troops on the Greek island of Lemnos out there. And as the Allies prepared for their next move, the Turks boosted their defences and started positioning troops right here along the shore and up in these tree-covered hills behind me. From the beginning, the Turks held the strategic high ground. Then, on April 25th, 1915, the Allies launched their attack. The ill-fated invasion would be the largest amphibious landing in the history of warfare up to that time. But by the time the Allies landed here, on this beach, the Ottoman army had dug in with machine guns at the ready. Chaos broke out immediately as the soldiers came ashore and desperately tried to escape the hail of bullets coming from the hills behind me. Men leapt out of the boats into deep water, encumbered with their rifles and their 70 pounds of kit, recalled Captain Richard Willis of C Company, and some of them died right there, while others reached the land only to be cut down by the barbed wire. Keep coming along this way. Imagine these turquoise waters of the Aegean Sea turning crimson as the stiff Turkish resistance struck down the waves of Allied forces that charged ashore. Imagine the sound of this battle, of rifles firing, the agonied sounds of the wounded and the dying, the choking smell of gunpowder and sweat, and the stench of the dead. There were unimaginable horrors taking place all around here. The Battle of Gallipoli became a slaughter from the get-go and quickly morphed into a stalemate just as bloody as that of the Western Front. Despite suffering heavy casualties, the Allies managed to establish two beachheads, one at Helles Peninsula on the southern tip, and here at Gaba Tepe on the Aegean coast, which was later dubbed Anzac Cove, in honour of the Australian and New Zealand troops who fought so valiantly to establish their positions here. In lower sections of the battlefield, the enemies faced each other from 200 or 300 yards away. But on the narrow ridges up here near Chunkbair, one of the highest points on the peninsula and a principal objective of the Allies, Anzac and Ottoman soldiers were separated by just a few yards, close enough for each side to lob grenades and bombs into each other's trenches. You dug deep and you erected barbed wire netting on top to protect yourself, says Harrington, one of the soldiers at the time. And if you had time, you threw the grenades back. And as I walk these shores, it's clear to me now why this was such a difficult battle to wage for the Allies. Just look at the ruggedness of this territory, of this terrain, and how the cliffs rise up immediately from the shore. And it's no wonder the Allies faced such difficulty here. All along, they were trying to capture the high ground, and all along they were fighting an uphill battle. And after this failed landing, the Allies were able to make little progress from this site as the Turks gathered more troops on the peninsula from the Palestine and Caucasus fronts. Of course, while the Turkish troops held the high ground and had the upper hand strategically, they also suffered terribly. They fought under desperate conditions and received little or no pay for their work. Some fought barefoot, where others took boots and clothes from dead Allied soldiers. Others again used material from sandbags to patch their torn uniforms. There were shortages of food and medical supplies amongst Ottoman troops, and like the Allies, the Ottoman army also faced problems in terms of evacuating their wounded from the battle. Most of the soldiers in the Ottoman army were illiterate. Only 5% could read or write, and those soldiers who could read and write wrote letters home and eagerly awaited letters in return. The longest Turkish letter to survive the Gallipoli campaign was written by Captain Mick Davie to his parents. "I am writing you these lines," he said, "so that you will have something to remember me by." He wrote that from right here at Anzac Cove on the 31st of May in 1915, and he went on, "You as my parents did all you could to raise me and make it possible for me to serve my country and my people. But I do not have hope to survive future battles in which I will fight." Davie was killed 2 weeks later. So we're here at Beach Cemetery, located at what was known as Hell's Spit at the southern end of Anzac Cove. And it was given its name because fighting here was 8.5 months of hell for the men on both sides. And this is one of 34 Allied cemeteries located along the peninsula. Now, the Allies landed on this peninsula on the 25th of April 1915, and Beach Cemetery was used from the day of the landing at Anzac Cove almost until the evacuation. And many of those who were laid to rest here died of their wounds while they were waiting to receive medical attention, or were killed by Ottoman artillery, which targeted the beach just below us. And it's here, in this very beautiful place, this lovely, tranquil, serene spot, that I want to show you this very special and important grave. It's here that John Simpson Kirkpatrick is died. Kirkpatrick was from the 3rd Australian Field Ambulance Division, and he's better known to most Australians as Simpson and his donkey. He was a field ambulance stretcher bearer, and he landed here on the 25th of April 1915, along with the rest of the Anzac contingent, and he was immediately thrust into harm's way. He was just 22 years of age at the time. Now, day and night, Simpson worked in the midst of gunfire, exposing himself to terrible danger, carrying the wounded on the donkey from the head of Monash Valley up that way, down through Shrapnel Gully to the beach below us. And his work was so highly valued that he was allowed to operate independently of his battalion, camping with his donkey at the Indian soldiers' mule camp, and his name immediately became synonymous with courage. The Indian troops called him Bahadur, which means the bravest of the brave. And it was written that Simpson earned the admiration of everyone at the upper end of the valley, and the help that he rendered to the wounded was invaluable. Simpson, it was said, knew no fear, and he moved unconcernedly amid shrapnel and rifle fire, steadily carrying out his self-imposed task day by day, and he frequently earned the applause of the personnel for his many fearless rescues of wounded men. Tragically, Simpson's inspirational work and good fortune were short-lived, and just 3 weeks after the landing here, he was killed by a Turkish bullet during one of his morning journeys up Monash Valley to retrieve wounded men. And he was just 22 years old at the time. Simpson has become a true Australian legend and one of the country's most famous and best-loved heroes. And it's a real honour for me, actually, to have just seen his grave. He's an incredibly important figure in Australian history. And speaking of military heroes, the last surviving soldier of any of the armies who fought here died peacefully in May 2002, aged remarkably 103. He was an Australian named Alec Campbell. Now, Campbell had lied about his age and enlisted in the army when he was 16 to go off to war with the Australian Imperial Forces, affectionately known as the Kid to his soldier mates. He spent 6 weeks here at the front line before being evacuated as he was too ill to fight. And his death many, many years later triggered a massive reaction across Australia. All of the country's major newspapers commemorated his passing, and Australia's Prime Minister actually attended his funeral to pay his respects. At 11 o'clock in the morning on that day, the entire nation paused for a minute to pay their respects to Campbell and to all of the Australians who fought at Gallipoli and forged the Anzac legend. And amongst the flowers that were laid outside the cathedral for Campbell was a wreath that had been sent by a local Turkish association. And until recent years, it would have been seen as somewhat provocative for a Turkish group to link itself to Australia's Anzac experience. But over the last few decades, Turks and Australians have seemingly buried their enmity and now see Gallipoli as a unique bond between the two nations. And that mutual respect is summed up by a small article that appeared in the Sydney Morning Herald the day after Campbell was buried. An Australian working in Montreal, Canada, had mentioned Campbell's death to a Turkish work colleague. And the Turk replied, "In Turkey," he said, "we don't consider them as the enemy anymore. They fought bravely, and Turkey is proud of the war fought on both sides. It was our greatest military victory, but your sons, buried in Turkey, are our sons too." It's a little strange, I have to admit. I'm getting a bit choked up as I walked around here. I never expected to feel quite so emotional about visiting Gallipoli. But as an Australian, you grow up hearing these stories, and they feed a sense of who you are as an Australian. And it's really powerful to come here and to be so close to the people who forged our country's identity. We're going to head up the hill now, up to a very special place called Lone Pine. So we're on our way up to Lone Pine, but before we get there, I want to share a little bit of perspective with you. When the Australians and other Allied forces landed at Anzac Cove, which is way, way down there in the distance, they immediately tried to climb the hills that rose straight up out of the beach, but they were bombarded by heavy Turkish artillery and were forced to dig in to build trenches and take cover. Then over the next 8 months, they fought their way inch by inch up those hills in the distance, over that pine-covered ridge and onto this plateau where they dug in again. Now, when people think of World War I, they often think of trench warfare, and trenches were a big part of the story here at Gallipoli too. And if you look at the ground around me, you can see it's pitted very heavily with the remnants of hundreds of trenches, most of which have eroded into shallow depressions and have been filled in with silt. The ground's rather rough here, and I'm going to feel a burn in my legs, and I'm sure you will too on your machines. But in 1915, this area was the battlefield home of hundreds of young Australian soldiers. And just above that ridge in the distance was a network of trenches bristling with thousands of Turkish soldiers. And early one morning, little more than a century ago, an Australian soldier sat hunched in his trench and considered the enemy in a letter that he wrote home. And in that letter he said, "Everything is so still and so quiet, one would never dream that two opposing forces, each eager for each other's blood, were separated by only a few yards, and in some places by only a few feet. Archaeologists have identified 9 miles of frontline trenches, communication trenches, and tunnels burrowed by the two sides. During that time, both Allied and Ottoman forces would dig tunnels underneath each other's positions and pack them with explosives, detonate those explosives, which would cause enormous casualties to the enemy. And if we take a look over here, you'll see the remnants of one of those tunnels. So Allied Australian soldiers would have travelled underneath the ground here all the way up to the Turkish positions, a couple of 100 yards up that way, and blown up the trenches underneath them. We're approaching one of the most sacred spaces here on the peninsula, the site of the infamous Battle of Lone Pine. By August 1915, after several months of stalemate, the Allied commanders at Gallipoli were desperate to turn the tide, and they launched a major offensive on this area, which today is a beautifully and tenderly cared for cemetery. Now, when British and Anzac troops arrived at the battleground here, they were surprised to find that many of the Turkish trenches were fortified with timber roofs. They fired, bombed, and bayoneted from above to get inside the trenches. And by nightfall, the Anzacs had taken control of most of the front line. But that's in fact when the real battle began. From nightfall on the 6th through the 9th, a fierce battle raged underground in a complex maze of Ottoman tunnels that ran underneath this area. The Turks desperately tried to expel the Australians, but the Anzac troops managed to hold their position. And despite the Anzac victory at Lone Pine, the overall offensive failed and resulted in thousands of casualties on both sides. When the battle was over, some 2,300 men were killed or wounded across the Anzac battalions, and over 6,000 Turks had been killed or wounded. Of course, over here, this is the singular pine tree which gives this area its name, Lone Pine, and it casts its shadow over the graves here, keeping them shaded in the hot summer weather. And up ahead of us, we have one of the most touching monuments on the peninsula. This is the cenotaph. And this structure memorializes the names of over 5,000 Allied soldiers who died here and whose bodies or graves were never found. Their names are all inscribed on this wall. It's absolutely shocking to think that so many people could have died in battle and no trace of them remains. So how does this story end? Well, in December 1915, with blizzards and frigid temperatures sapping morale and Ottoman forces moving more heavy artillery into position to begin bombarding the trenches, Lord Kitchener, the Secretary for War, ordered a nighttime withdrawal of the remaining 80,000 Allied troops from Gallipoli. They left behind self-firing guns and other diversions, and the Allied forces managed to board ships and sail away from the peninsula with almost no casualties. It was actually one of the few logistical successes in the 8-month debacle. Now, the Ottoman victory at Gallipoli, however, proved to be the Empire's last gasp. The Ottomans suffered punishing defeats in the Middle East at the hands of British and Arab forces, and their empire collapsed in 1918. In November of that year, British and French warships finally sailed unopposed through the Dardanelles, which you can see just over here behind me. And they finally captured Istanbul. As we come to the edge of this ridge, we will have come to the end of our walk. And while this was a place of sorrow and unfathomable tragedy, it was also a place that inspired courage and sacrifice, where the notion of mateship among Australians was truly born. I'm proud to have made this pilgrimage to this sacred soil, and I hope that you've enjoyed the journey too. I'm Mick Davie, your iFit guide, and I hope you'll join me again soon.